بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. يا ربنا اغفر لنا ذنوبنا لقد ظلمنا أنفسنا ولا غافر لذنوب إلا أنت، فنتوجه إليك ونستغفرك ونتوب إليك. والعصر إن الإنسان في خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. أما بعد. Last time uh, we brought up this discussion of children in Salah. And so one of the things that's very interesting in my rebound on my bad. Last time uh, we brought up this discussion of children in Salah. And so one of the things that's very interesting in my rebound research is that in Maliki fiqh, one of the things that they bring up with regard to one of the things that they bring up with regard to the children is in the application of the hadith of discipline or disciplining for the salah. You find in the fiqh books with some repetition. The idea in afada, and if it's beneficial, then you engage in the physical discipline, so to speak. It, so that's very interesting, right? And that lines up with the way that Sheikh Mukhtar Shanqiti, in his explanation, although in this case he's explaining Zad and Stakna, but the Shanatiqa, or those people from Shanqit or Mauritania, they they generally, suck up a Maliki curriculum from a young age. So one of the things that shines through in his explanation of Zad al-Mustaqna is this issue. And I think from the angle of him being a contemporary scholar, uh, it's extremely beneficial. So that's something that I thought that it will, it overlaps with the class, but it's a point that you find in the Maliki curriculum itself, that is stated. And you find, contemporary scholars, some of them take up that question, of how do you deal with this hadith and how do you deal with the grooming of the child into salah. In practice, it's a sensitive issue because the reality of the situation is when you look at things sociologically, when you look at things sociologically, so on the sociological level, a child, you would think that the parents, are the number one force in that child's um development. But in reality, you have social media, you have the general culture, you have the schools, you have the peer group, you have siblings, right? And so, that child's development is impacted by all of these other forces. So the parents are really competing, with these forces that impact the child. The parent usually is not on the same level of influence, at least at a certain age. That's why the age range that's mentioned, the age range that's mentioned, in today's time, the age range being 7, 10 is kind of on is kind of on the older side already. But in today's time, when you mention 7 years old, you have to realize that in some communities, I hate to say it in this way, but by the time the child is hitting like 10 years old, the child may already be in situations where they're being close to being tried as an adult. So think about that 10-year-old range, when you start talking about 10, 12, 10, 11, 12, 13, that range. it's almost like already they're young adults in some communities. And even when you start talking about other cultures, the level of responsibility is it's on a higher level. You know, compared to the US, but we're focusing mostly on the US. Children are already working in some cultures. They're engaged in child labor and all kinds of stuff like that. But there's no doubt that, the psychological factor here, when you look at the children, some of these young guys, where they're at these ages, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, all the way up to 25, there's a deep immaturity. Okay. So here, when we talk about the forces that impact the child, the forces that educate the child in some way, the question comes up, you know, the question that comes up is waiting until 7 too late in terms of developing the child? Thoughts about that?
You're saying developing the child in what way? In praying?
In the context of what we're talking about, yeah.
Um,
Given all these realities,
I guess I have no idea.
I mean, I've seen some children like naturally gravitate towards what the parents are doing or what the other people are doing, especially.
now you added a component.
Hmm.
So you have the home component, extended family, as
Yeah,
we,
like just the environment.
and then you have the community.
Hmm.
So now that child, there's the parents, their impact is a little more extended out because the extended family, the community may be duplicating,
Yeah.
the lesson.
I also, I mean, I also feel like I'm not a parent, but I also feel like sometimes there's a learning curve for the parent with their child at that age because they don't know the personality of their child. Like I know, like I have my live experience of having people teach come and try to teach me something and then use physical punishment when I got it wrong. I ran. I was like, yo, I want nothing to do with this stuff, because if I'm going to get hit every time I make a mistake or having too much of an American accent, then I don't even want to do this anymore. Like, I was a runner, and I don't think my parents knew that as immigrants, that if we hit this kid, she's going to she's going to reject everything. Like, you don't know your kids, or you think your kids are like other kids, and they're not. Like, I've seen kids when I worked at the Islamic school and I did academics for the Hibs children. There were some kids that were like forced and forced and forced into memorizing Quran, and it just was not their thing. They just couldn't do it, and they were like, verbally, and like just kind of a lot of this pressure, and the parents were like forcing their child to do something that it just wasn't inclined or intellectually like able to keep up with the other children. It's just that they knew that they wanted their kid to be a hafiz, but they didn't take into consideration that child's own, you know, like academic levels. Some kids are strong in math, some kids are strong in language. You sitting over there hitting a kid and you don't know
Well,
what
that's
their
where
capacities
that's
are.
where here when we talk about these forces in general, we're talking about this in a general way. But when you start going into the detail, are the parents at the level to teach their children?
Hmm.
Are the schools, whether Islamic or non-Islamic environments, because you can have a non-Islamic school with an MSA in it,
Right.
something like that. Are they environments that really have the literacy level, the teachers even, their literacy level and the technique, and the same thing with the parents to really transfer Islam?
Hmm.
You know what I'm saying? That's where all of that stuff becomes a question. I don't want to focus too much further on that, but one of the advantages of community is, and even Islamic school, one of the advantages more than anything is having a daily routine wherein prayer is being established. But even as adults, we fall short.
Hmm.
Let's get away from that. Where anything can throw us off in reality in today's time, unless you're in that routine. And this is something we have to think about. The reality of Sharia, uh, the concept of graduality, right? Or
I think what
the
should be
drej,
taken
huh?
I think what should be taken into consideration is, like, the environment that you live, the hadith we're talking about, or that we're trying to you know make some, have some understanding, comprehension of it. It was geared, around, the messages should be like they were back in the past, the hub of the community.
Right.
Whereas, if you see a lot of people living in Muslim communities, where, like for Ramadan, the children will go to the masjid. They won't exactly pray, but they will get, they will play and then pray and then things like that. You see that a lot in America, but like in Muslim countries, like yourself, Yusuf, you see that even more. So the masjid becomes a central part and fabric of of the whole family. So that has to be taken in consideration also.
But that's why we did this part here, that
Uh-huh.
this duplication process, duplicating the lesson,
Right.
duplicating the lesson just of the, we're only here really talking about Salah. It happens in the home. It happens in the is reflected in the extended family. Is it reflected in the community?
Yeah.
Friends in the community includes the masjid and everything like that.
Yes.
So that helps. But even when you start looking, you know what I'm saying, overseas, sometimes uh sometimes overseas, even with the environment being there, uh, is not necessarily the case that that's going to work.
Mm.
Because sometimes deep down inside, the way, depending on the way it's done, these these environments may create an environment of what you call it. They create an environment where um الكراهية الكراهية للصلاة يعني يربون الكراهية للصلاة. They develop in the child, or they cultivate in the child, uh, through the way that they educate and the way that they communicate the practice of the salah.
Mm.
A hatred of it, a dislike of it, right? So either way, it's not an easy reality. That's why I pause
Yes.
on this. That's why I pause on
Yes.
this, because it's not an easy reality. It's not like we're considering where we were at. It's no longer an easy reality to deal with.
Yeah. And at that age, I mean, I'm just like, I'm kind of amazed. Like the children that I'm working with now, it's amazing how some of them have never really even been. It's never even been evaluated. Like like if a child has autism or something,
Yeah,
like you just
yeah.
don't know.
That is not even within the. It's not even within the purview.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I went to a conference and I brought that up, uh, and it became a back and forth between me and one of the presenters. And I get it. The presenter, that necessarily wasn't his aim and objective, to deal with that. He was talking on curriculum and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But my argument was like, you guys have money.
Right.
So I don't want to hear the standard curriculum stuff,
Right.
when in reality, the reality of the situation is that, uh, we don't even have time to play with that concept.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have time to play with the concept of an ideal Muslim and speaking to an ideal Muslim.
Right.
We're dealing with situations where the training of those that are going to teach Islam has to be done right from the beginning. We don't need a duplication of programs. We have a
Right.
lot of people that are already, thinking in the cookie cutter approach, and they're not dealing with the reality on the ground. But that's where the Muslims are at, because the Muslims don't like to admit that they have issues. And
Right.
the reality is, and I'm going to say something that's going to fall really harsh for some people, is some cultures, many of these cultures, they're marrying their cousins.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. It's very common.
so the probability of issues coming up because you're marrying within the first cousin circle, it's not like third, fourth cousin. That's the
Nope.
reality, is like the first cousin circle. So you're seeing, and I see it in engaging. I see it. You see, on top of environmental issues.
Yeah.
There's a lot of environmental issues that are not discussed, but you're seeing the amount of children with developmental disabilities
Mhm.
and challenges. The amount is very apparent just at eyes level. Just you look around.
Mhm.
That's not mentioning environmental factors. If we were to take it outside the context of the U.S., it gets more complicated. Uh, but when you start looking at the percentages of children, just what you mentioned on the spectrum by itself, that
Mhm.
concept of on the spectrum, when you start talking about things like ADHD, even though ADHD is contested, and I get the contested nature of it, but the reality of the situation is that when you go to teach, even adults, we don't have uh, coordinated concentration.
Mhm.
We have to have a lot of things to keep our attention in play. But
Yeah.
children, the children are faced with a number of challenges, and people, there's other things, physical disabilities as well that impact education. So at the end of the day, that's not mentioning psychological issues.
Yeah.
Children that have been exposed, that they associate with the religion, not because of Islam, but because of somebody that violated trust with them. So they associate with the religion a negative experience.
Yeah.
I'll give you an example. When I was in Egypt, there was a child that was sexually abused. I didn't know about the case directly. I knew about it indirectly because I was told about it. And it was a child. There was an African American child was studying with an Egyptian, learning Quran, and the Quran teacher was exposing that child to pornography and exposing that child uh, to physical sexual abuse.
Mhm.
And so now that child has to contend with Quran and the experience
Yeah.
of sexual abuse. That's a terrible association.
Yeah. My ex-husband used to get the belt, on his daughter, like play the Quran if she did something haram at age 4 or 5, play the Quran, get tell her to go get the belt, and I'm just thinking like, I mean, that's a permanent like imprint
Or
on your life, right? She's gonna remember that for the rest of her life.
Well, that's the same thing with the whole beating, beating in the Quran. Although it works for some people, the question is it totally Islamic? But a lot of people have learned Quran bil asa. They've been beat down. When it comes to it. So when it comes to memorization and so on and so forth. So this is why you have dysfunctionality in the society. You know what I'm saying? And it creates a really terrible environment to be in. But we put a lot of time into this. But the idea is, that the in afada, as the Maliki say, if it's beneficial, if the discipline is going to benefit
very important.
the then then that's something that has to be looked at. But if it's going to take the child away, then you have to start getting into other uh technicalities, and we're facing you have to get into other approaches, and you have to come up with other type of solutions. And so the challenge of parents is what we mentioned, the parents are competing with a lot of forces that impact the child's development, and those forces may not align. And just because you put your child also in an Islamic school doesn't automatically mean that that's going to align with Islam or the education that you want to provide that child. It has to be it has to be thought through.
I guess I'm just wondering, like, who makes that? Like, are we expecting that the parent knows, is gonna know when physical discipline is beneficial or not?
I don't think that question. I get the validity of the question, but I don't think it's a question that is going to be in its place because from the angle of this is like train the trainer. Everyone here, like this is basic knowledge. Like what we're looking at is basic knowledge, but we're expanding out the theme that comes up. So that's why firstly, everyone, we may not like to hear that, right? But as a community, we may not like to hear it, but that's why everyone is obligated to a certain level of knowledge. Whether the Muslims like it or not, the obligation still is there. Now, on the practical level, that's why we educate ourselves and we try to work on ourselves and we try to communicate these concepts because we know that this is not part of the general literacy program that Muslims are a part of. You have a lot of you have a lot of professionals that they neglect their children completely. You have a lot of working parents that they don't have the capacity. It's not that they it's not an education issue, right? They just don't have the capacity to really deal with these things because of the conditions of survival, the conditions that survival put upon them. They don't have that ability. You have a lot of single or you have a lot of families that are divorced as well, and creates an environment where there's less impact on the part of the parents to be able to implement things. You have children that are growing up in different types of households, because of the split in the parents. So one may be growing up with practicing parents, the other one, the in, in one household, I should say, there's practice, in the other household, there's not. So that you have a lot of diverse environments. So that's why for us, the idea is to reflect on how these texts, how do you take this conversation to the contemporary realities that we're dealing with. And on the part of the imams that do the general education, then the imam is obligated to spread from the minbar the importance of addressing the problem of abuse and neglect when it comes to education and the deen, right? The role of the imam becomes extremely important. The role of teachers becomes important in general. And that's why education has to be taken seriously. Uh, but the parents, some of them will fight you because they themselves reinforce uh, an abusive type of education. They're some of them are about physical and verbal, especially verbal abuse. But ideally, everyone is responsible for their own. Uh,
Um,
But we know that that's not going to work at the end of the day. One of the things also that comes up in when we talked about this before, going back, coming to the top of the page, is that from the yani shurut salah, some say here from the conditions in some instances we can say in this case we can say prerequisites. Uh, we said that the prerequisites doesn't work for the soundness of the salah, but it works for the obligations as far as a word that's used in translation. Yani shurut al-wujub. Interestingly, this comes up in so some say Islam, some say also they add on bulugh al-da'wah that I shouldn't put it like that because that's not gonna let's put it like this: exposure uh, to knowledge because of the example that's given. They talk about like somebody being in a mountain and away from the people and so on and so forth. So Islam and bulugh al-da'wah, sometimes they separate the two, or exposure to the knowledge. Sometimes Islam, as a condition, it said, oh, you know what, this shouldn't be there. It's already kind of a given that we're talking to a Muslim. Either way, again, we take these texts as starting points. We can argue about how things should be said, where things should be. Uh, that's the whole point of these types of texts being written, so that our conversation on these issues becomes more and more grounded in knowledge and it's not just up in the air and it's not just like a you know passerby discussion on the train, so to speak. That we talk about it for a few minutes just to entertain ourselves and we move forward. No, the scholars took this quite serious, and it was more than just a tabletop discussion. It was something that was taken serious and it was addressed systematically. But some bring up the issue of bulugh al-da'wah. For us, that's important in the environment that we live in because of being mixed with non-Muslims. In the Muslim world, in a place like Saudi, it's a lot different because of the work that has been put in place. Whether we agree with them or not, it's not my concern. But the work that has been put in place is the work to create an environment where the environment there's no room for ignorance, and that's why there's a lot of debate. Um, there's a lot of debate when it comes to that type of environment, whether a person is yani ma'zur bil jahl, as they say, is excused by ignorance, and so they work to the extent where they had reached the level of saying no. In this environment, because of the facilitation of the spread of the deen as far as his knowledge is concerned, and because of the implementation as far as his practice is concerned, at least at the arkan level, at the foundational level, it's so widespread that we can't excuse that person by ignorance, right? So that's something that has to be really considered. Can't, you know, excuse that person by ignorance. So in our environment, That's not necessarily the case because of the factors that we brought up. These environments don't they don't allow us to assume that people understand Islam, even in the context of the masjid, even in the context of the minbar, because we have a reality wherein anybody can do a khutbah. Even when it comes to the internet, anybody can really teach at this point in time, right? So we have to have a little more wiggle room in that people may not be at the level to to understand. So blue exposure to knowledge is an important factor uh, on two levels, whether the person is Muslim or not Muslim. In the case where we say that the case that the person is already Muslim, then Islam is kind of just a given as a condition for the salah that the person is Muslim. But some households, the person may be exposed to Islam, but not even know how to pray, right? So that's the level that we're at. That when it comes to it, I say that not it's not theoretical. There were times back in the day where brothers would go visiting different uh, businesses or communities, and they would discover that the youth didn't know how to pray Salah. They grew up in Muslim household and didn't know how to pray Salah at 20 something years old. Right? So when we talk about the conditions of obligation, here they're listed as five, Islam being one. Some scholars debating on whether this should be here or not. And we mentioned that, okay, even if it's a given, then in the case of dealing with the non-Muslim, uh, then there's the issue of how do you communicate the reality of the prayer? Well, before the prayer can even be communicated, the reality of just communicating the basics of Tawheed have to be in place. Okay, what about if the person is a Muslim by birth, so to speak, but then the exposure, bulugh da'wah, in its more extensive sense is not there? So then that's why exposure to knowledge of bulugh da'wah is important. So those discussions that the scholars have, some of them adding bulugh da'wah, some of them saying it's something separate from Islam. Bulugh da'wah meaning that they have to be exposed to the information, exposed to the deen itself. They have somebody has to tell them about the deen. They may not have, had that exposure. There's many examples of this. There was a time where the Palestinians in Puerto Rico were celebrating Christmas and eating pork until a brother came from Syria. They say his name is Brother Maher, rahmatullah alayhi, from my understanding. And he started teaching them and they began to practice. Now, in this instance, they knew that they were Muslim. They grew up understanding that they were Muslim, but then in the lifestyle, uh, the practice was not there. So that's why the discussion of Bulugh Dawah is extremely important. Bulugh Dawah is extremely important. It is not added here, but in other texts it is added. And that's why the discussion on the conditions for the Salah, it's they vary from text to text. because when you start looking at what is needed in order for Islam to be established, you start running into some challenges when you move away from the ideal. And that brings us right back to what we were talking about special education and so on and so forth. That some Muslims, they operate from a norm that does not exist, because they're operating from a space that they want to make normative, but it does not exist. You know, then this becomes even more problematic uh, when you look at some of the things that are being said here, like in this whole section. I don't want to repeat this right now, but when you look at some of the things that are being said about what is the ruling of the person that abandons the Salah and so on and so forth. Here, no mention is made here. This is the problem of taking this type of judgment from a basic book in fiqh without nuances and without conditions is extremely problematic because it leads to a mentality that doesn't know how to deal with people, right? And other bil jahil, or being excused by ignorance, is a big discussion in aqidah, in law, you know what I'm saying, overall. Not to mention our own struggles. Somebody can be Muslim 20, 30 years and fall into a major crisis with the self. So these things are kind of like, ideal statements about what would be the case if everything is in order. But there's no discussion about how to build when things are out of order. You kind of, and ironically, this is, this is not Sheikh Uthman bin Fodi. Uh, this is Sheikh Uthman, Fulati, but one of the biggest mistake of these movements that's made when they come to establish the deen is this type of thing. They don't come with the minhaj of nubuwwah. Minhaj and nubuwwah is tadrij. The methodology of prophethood is to work with the people gradually. And some people don't like to hear that, but that's the minhaj of the Quran, minhaj ilahi. Allah Ta'ala didn't establish the Salah firstly. What was established firstly was the realities, the foundations of Tawheed. And we're talking about as established in the Quran. We're not talking about how we do it in our educational centers and this scholar and that scholar, but how it was in the Quran. Belief in the unseen, belief in the hereafter, belief in reward and punishment, belief in Allah. All of those things were established. And then with time, the Salah was instituted after about a decade of training the believers into that reality, into what it means to be a Muslim. And remember that they had the living example of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. You know, so the embodiment of the values of Islam came before some of the practices that we know to be the core practices of the Deen. That's a discussion that's not had. Yeah, you know, and the believers, their experience was completely different in that their tawheed was tested by the experiences that they suffered in the environment. Look at Sumayyah, radiallahu anha. Sumayyah's tawheed was tested by a life or death situation, a testimony of faith, that led to her death because of the amount of resistance to change that was coming from her own people. And one of the things that's not mentioned many, many times is one of the things that Sumaya is known for in iconic or kind of idealistic presentations of her is that she was standing up for her dignity. And when she emphasized who the prophet was, for her, the prophet was someone that stood up for the dignity of the human being. And those are things that are not talked about much, in all these discussions on the lives of the Sahaba and so on and so forth. But that Islam came affirming these types of things, and that's part of the maqasid of the Sharia. I'm in total agreement with Imam al-Qarafi on that from the objectives of the Sharia is preservation of the dignity of the human being. Not only that, but creating conditions for that to exist. That the Sharia creates conditions for the dignity of the human being to exist. And we see how important that is. And that was the statement, one of the statements of one of my teachers, Sheikh Muhammad Mahdi, from the scholars of Algeria. Uh, and he's from Al Azhar, but from the scholars of Algeria, one of the things was said, if you don't think that this is one of the objectives of the Sharia, look around. Look in the world today. If you don't think that that's important, the centrality of the dignity of the human being in our lifestyle, in our lives, that it has to be something that's upheld. Then look at around the world today. Yeah, this is one of the major issues that everybody's contesting. A dignified life on multiple levels, whether it's material or otherwise.
Sheikh Yusuf, who is Imam Qarafi?
Imam al-Qarafi was a student of Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. And but he was a great Maliki scholar. And he was from Egypt. And he was one of the ones that really looked at Maliki fiqh from a very when he began to write and study and teach and all of that type of stuff, there were certain developments that took place in how this type of knowledge was communicated. And so he was one of the ones that systematized the Maliki approach or orientation and bringing out a discussion on the reasons why rulings take place or the reason why a ruling is taken and what are the underlying principles, what are the underlying concepts, what are the guiding maxims, what are the evidences according to not only textual evidences, but as far as also the objective of the Sharia and also sometimes reason as well. So Qarafi has a nice hand in that, in the way that he teaches fiqh. Those things, one of the things that comes up, especially within the Salafi approach, is a criticism of the way that madhabi fiqh was taught. And as much as people dislike it, that is not always, I think to say that it's a criticism of madhabs in general is not always a fair take on that, right? It's not always a fair take. I think because when you go deep into the discussion, like you'll see like a Sheikh Al-Albani or somebody like that, he'll criticize madhab-based fiqh, but then he'll pick a book like Manar al-Sabib and say, well, this book from the educational value, it has qualities that are beneficial to communicate to the students. You learn certain things. There's certain learning objectives that can be reached if you use this text, if you use this approach. That's the part of the Salafi da'wah that people that are uneducated in general don't bring out. Also, the whole issue of teaching with hadith from an early start, learning a few hadith. There were some hardliners in Madhhabi fiqh that refused to even teach uh, the sources of the deen, not necessarily the madhabs themselves, but the teachers. The reason why I bring this up is because a style like Qarafi in teaching, you can simplify it. And that's basically what the Salafi Da'wah was looking for. That you just don't give me a text where some sheikh is saying XYZ, this is deen, and you can't justify it. You see what I mean? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So that's where the debate has to be taken, in its proper context. Now, does it go to an extreme? It does. Because there's a time and a place for discussion on evidences. Sometimes, again, when you start looking at people's needs and people's educational capacity or their learning styles, and just what's suitable to them, somebody, it's okay to just tell them, X, Y, Z, how you do this without giving them a detailed explanation. That has its place. For children, for a lot of circumstances and situations, it has its place. Today that we covered, or this, or the basically three, you can say really, are the concept of excusing people by ignorance, العذر بالجهل. The other issue is returning back to education of the youth. The role, how do you implement the hadith, which obligates to the salah? And the third is the issue of, again, the topic coming back up, the fiqh styles or the different approaches to communicate fiqh. That's important. And how to deal with these types of texts and take benefit from them. Right? They do simplify a lot of, really the problem comes back to the teachers. The teachers are the ones that create the problem. The same thing when it comes to Aqidah studies. The teachers are the ones that create the problem. When you have ill-trained teachers, weak teachers, then you have issues. And that's the problem. The same thing with translation. Same thing with translation. A lot of translation that was occurring at the hands of people that really didn't study. They couldn't even speak Arabic, and they were translating texts, and and that created a big dilemma for them, for us actually, in general. So the teachers, that's why part of this can't just be reading a text and just finishing the text. What also how to think through the text, how to think with the text, has to be part of the process. It's kind of like training the trainer type of thing. It has to almost be done at that level, keeping in mind that everybody can hang. That's why there's no necessity to extend out the circle. In my mind, to have 10 people or whatever, there's no 15 people. That's
Is it a why is it not a general understanding that all the madhabs are correct?
the madhabs themselves created that problem. They're doing that right now. The idea of the madhabs, the concept right now that the madhabs, are the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah and so on and so forth. The madhabs themselves created that problem. They try to blame that on the Salafi Da'wah. That's not true. The Salafi Da'wah did increase hostility towards the madhabs because of the hostility, trying to eliminate the hostility the madhabs had for each other. That's historically documented. That's not some sort of Salafi uh, conjecture that they make up to justify themselves. Even in the U.S., we have examples of that. Of the problem of madhabism, and it's
Yeah.
going to come back. It's going to come back when you start having a diverse community and then a masjid trying to impose without sensitivity. Notice that I said without sensitivity, one way of practicing without sensitivity. You can, it's clear that, it's beneficial to have one way of practicing, but with sensitivity, right? With sensitivity that can work. Then there's uniformity and then there's people, they get used to it. But when someone is imposing his, like there was one situation in which a brother took it upon himself to question everybody that came to the masjid if they wiped on their socks or not.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? Uh, and then what kind of sock did you wipe on? And he made it. He was making because because the approach that he's taking, even if you try to say is the majority or whatever, is that you can only wipe over socks that don't allow water to come through. And usually they're not even looking for that. They're talking about leather socks,
Mm-hmm.
not looking at the other details of the socks. And that's because they're against the opinion that was built on Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah's understanding that the khuf is anything that covers the foot, even if it is light, and you can wipe over anything, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, there's some details with that, but that's what happens. You begin to enforce one opinion over another opinion. Same thing when it comes to the Juma khutbah. Enforcing that it only the Arabic language is to be utilized in the khutbah. The Hanafi school in today's time from the subcontinent took a position that's not even a Hanafi position because they want to enforce a concept that they have.
Yep.
And it has its benefits. It has its benefit, but it also has its problems with it.
Right.
So then, how they get around that is like they do a talk in English,
Right.
then they go and they do a khutbah in Arabic. So then, your concept is what? What is your concept of dawah? What is your concept of education? It's just formality. And that's
Mm-hmm.
what that same psychology goes into the study of hadith, by the way. And it goes into the same psychology goes into the study of fiqh. Some of them are masters at this stuff. I'm not denying this scholarship without a doubt. I'm not even in a position to do that, but yeah, there's a culture that's there that is deen is routine. One time he said to me, he said, you didn't mention Abu Bakr, uh, Uthman, you didn't mention Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali in the khutbah. I said, I told him it's not a condition. But because of the routine, that's how you know the, that's how they understood the deen.
Yes.
Routine. And look, when and then it's like you bring in routine into an environment where routine, it's like routine has benefit, but not always. That's why these types of like this type of thing here that's mentioned here about the issue of the ruku' and the sujood, that if
Mm-hmm.
a person denies that they're kafir and so on and so forth, you teach that to certain people, you don't know where that goes. So you can't just openly teach that like that. Something that was stated in the context of a, you know, 500 years ago in another type of political context, in another environment, you have to know how to communicate that stuff. And that's why the concept of the Bulugh Dawa, Qadi Iyad is one of the ones that brings that up.
MashaAllah.
He brings that up in his writings. That's one of the conditions of the Salah. Like the people have to know, not just Islam, not just being Muslim, like we mentioned, but they have to be educated in general. That's not even mentioned there because there's none of the whole issue of knowledge is not even mentioned because there's this understanding that every Muslim is going to be going through this whole literacy process.
Like,
Right.
yeah, you're
Huh?
saying like it's a given.
It's a given, yes. Being Muslim is a given. Having the knowledge of the Salah is a given. Having the knowledge of reciting the Quran is a given. It's a given. One of my
That can't
teachers,
be
one
further
of my
from the truth.
teachers, huh?
I said that can't be further from the truth.
One of my teachers mentioned like a lot of us we hype up on evidences and this that. He said we don't even know how to find the qibla without a some sort of device,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which is one of the conditions of the salah, right? For the for the salah to be considered sound, the fourth condition here that's mentioned is facing the direction of the qibla.
Yes.
So the average person, if you tell them, okay, find the qibla, immediately in today's time, what we all do is we rush to our phones. Well,
Right.
what about if the phone shuts down? How are you gonna and see the way that this like I've studied this from other fiqh perspectives as well, other teaching modalities, other fiqh models, and so on and so forth. And one of the things that the teachers do that's good is they say you have to know geography. So if you know geography at the basic level, you have to be conscious. And knowing where you stand, so to speak, on multiple levels, you know,
Yeah.
knowing, for instance, if the mountain is facing west, you know what I'm saying, knowing if this street, if it runs on south or east, you know what I'm saying, knowing
But
the
that,
geography.
that's a little kind of, isn't that kind of simple for like a person living in the campo, in the camps and the farms and things of that nature? They will automatically know, what direction the sun is going from his zenith, to his set, to the sunset, to his place, to his setting place, stuff of that nature. And a person, I guess if you're outdoors, then it's easy.
But that's the
Be
thing about it that the concept of outdoors is extremely important. I mean, you can study a building as well. You can know the directions in a building. You can figure that out because we that stuff has been mapped out. But even when it comes to salah time, put aside the whole issue of the qibla for the second. Mostly everybody goes by the calendar, but like I learned from American brothers, like go outside and look. Sometimes
yeah,
you see, sometimes you see that the time for Maghrib is not the time for Maghrib because
right.
the sun is still out.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Shay, where I'm at, I never, once I learned the chapter on the prayer time, I haven't paper, I just use it for a calendar on my wall. Like, and it's crazy because the brothers always say, how come you always on time, like, meet us for prayer, and you don't use the paper? Everything is there. It feels like more activism when I do that. Not saying this is for the paper, but, just the time, like, when we learn things, I don't know, it changes, it removes that dependence on way, you know what I mean? It just depends on
Yeah, and
Allah intended.
that dependency that we have it goes for the salat time and the qibla. You know what I'm saying? In that we're overly dependent on electronic technology. We have to go back a few steps. I'm not saying don't use it, but dependency totally is a problem. It's a problem because if you don't if it's off, that's one issue. It's a common issue on a daily basis. If it can be off, but the other issue is if it goes out, then you don't know what to do. The other issue is that is depending on the technology, totally grasping the mas'ala, totally grasping the issue that you should be grasping when it comes to salah. In this case, we're talking about the qibla, right? But the fourth and the fifth condition for the soundness of the salah is that the fourth is facing the qibla, right? That's mentioned here. The fifth is the entrance of the proper time. So, especially within the Maliki school, the breakdown of time has, its own lesson to it. It has its own lesson. But those things, I advise everybody to move away as much as possible from depending on the technology, to really study the lesson properly and to become more aware of geography, become more conscious of time, study, be outside, winter, the fall, whatever it is, if you have that capacity to do that. You utilize techniques, you know what I'm saying? If you're indoors, you can kind of see, where the light is at, where the light starts, where the light, what part of the building does the sun hit on when it first comes up, so to speak, when it goes down, so to speak. What
Yes, it's very important.
that's how properly the fiqh is taught. You know, properly the fiqh is taught. Like when you know your own geography, you know what I'm saying, then you have an understanding. We're living too much in ghafla. Like we're completely disconnected
صح.
the natural environment. We're disconnected from basics that give us an orientation. If people were really in tune, they will realize that we're losing a connection to the heavens. The On a daily basis, you can no longer rely on looking at the heavens to kind of utilize stars and all that type of stuff because there's so much that's going into polluting the air unintentionally and intentionally that we don't have any real connection. You can't see. You understand what I'm saying? You can't even. That's why the whole moon sighting thing becomes extremely problematic because the moon sighting concept, the more that the moon sighting reality in some places, we're almost forced to depend on calculation, or we're forced to depend on people that are not in our environment because the heavens are blocked. They're blocked, so you can't see. You know what I'm saying? You cannot literally see either through light or chemical pollution. I'm not advocating for depending on calculation, but what I'm saying is that even those that are citing, they're utilizing calculation to kind of approximate the time of whatever philosophy it is that they have, whether it's the birth of the crescent or whatever it is in the astronomical philosophy that they have. But simply put, they're utilizing the calculation to pinpoint the time range and in what geographical zone will there be visibility. That's how bad it is. That we can look at that from a positive, but there's a negative there, and that is that the disconnect from the environment. The climatic changes are extreme. They're not in some places. You just geographically those places you're forced to calculation. Like for instance, when you start going to certain regions like Alaska, where there's just light for days, or darkness for days. Those places, when it comes to the issue of the time, uh, whether it's the Salah time or whether it is the entry of the new month, they can't depend on their environment 100%. So they have to calculate based on the country or the geography closest to them, or they have to take Mecca, as an example to follow. And that has nothing to do with the politics of using calculation or not using calculation. It has to do with a geographical impediment, that environment does not allow for that. If we were to go to space, which these people are really trying to push, right, to move into space, we would have to have that concept. The same problem comes up with if living under the water, if we were to live under the water. Say for instance, if we would have to go into the ocean to live, so to speak, or if we're caught up, say for instance, if we're uh, incarcerated in a place where there's just like solitary confinement, we would have to come up with some system to calculate, to be able to determine time. But under normal circumstances, so to speak, then the issue becomes the geography. The geography. We have to come up with the geography, a geographical consciousness, and not only a geographical consciousness, an astronomical consciousness, because we should be paying attention to the way that the movement of the sun is. That's why, and as far as the calendars, there's always, because we're not at that level of mathematics. People take that as a joke. They bring up arguments. They say we're depending on the kuffar, all this stuff. No, but NASA is not just kuffar. There's Muslim working in NASA and places like that. The mathematics, that part of knowledge, we want to argue Aqidah issues, this, that, the use of logic and all that. But to me, that's all petty, because La ilaha illallah at the basic level suffices. But when it comes to civilization, when it comes to society and the maintenance and the development and preservation of society, then those things become very real challenges. How good are we at math? How good are we at science? You see what I'm saying? That's important for the establishment of community and deen at the end of the day. Those sciences become key in that. In today's time, but the model of Timbuktu and the model of the Andalus in terms of education was always interdisciplinary. The problem that we have is that we want to bring in interdisciplinary. We can't bring in interdisciplinary problems into the basics of Aqidah and spread that to the people. See what I'm saying? That's not, it defeats Nubuwah. We have to understand the Nubuwah speaks to multiple levels. But like, for instance, the Muslims, where they were at, like, for instance, the issue of direction. Well, we know that the earth is not flat from the science that we have. So, the idea of Allah being above the throne, so to speak, there's no necessity to go into the kayfiyah. There's no necessity to go into the howness of it. It's textual, that's it. But is there necessity for us to understand space and time and this and that? Yeah, that applies to us. It doesn't apply to Allah wa ta'ala.
Right.
The rules of space and time that we encounter or discover or that we clash with at times. Like, for instance, if you try to jump out of a building, you're going to encounter, the problems of physics. If you think that you're going to, walk on air the way that you walk on land, or walk on water the way that you walk on land, then at face value, either there's going to be an issue of karamat, something that defeats what the norm is governing that, to safeguard you, that you can walk on water. It's karamat. or
Right.
that you come out of that you come out of the 12-story building, and that you're just floating in the air without technology, without a boat, without a plane, without any of that. See, science, that's where science is at. Science is at the level where what we would consider karamat, science is uncovering certain realities for us. But that's part of the process of being Khalifa of Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala on the earth. There's no issue of that indeed. In terms of that the human being is unique. The Quran tells us that. The human being has a certain degree of dominance over the creation. And the intellect is part of taklif. Taklif being what obligates us to our responsibilities. But what has happened in Islamic civilization is that there's a bifurcation. There's a split between al-ayat al-kawniyya wal-ayat al-diniyya.
That's what I wanted to.
Huh?
That's what I wanted to ask you. Where you're at with that, with as far as the ayat al-kawniyya.
That has the al-ayat al-kawniyya is where, if you ask me, most of the struggles in Aqidah have to be directed in that direction. Not in the direction of this group versus that group, because we already have those debates. They've been debated for years.
Yes.
Ages, hundreds of years. But how do you deal with the problems when it comes the ayat kawniyya? People means that the knowledge. First of all, there's three sources of knowledge in general: revelation, and then the creation breaks up into two: the human being, and then the rest of the creation, which we call the universe, el-kawn, or existence in that regard. So all of this we say comes from Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. So the ayat of the Quran or the Diniya and the Sunnah, it complements the Quran. But the ayat of the Quran is revelation. That's one source of knowledge. The ayat of the environment is the ayat of the creation of Allah Tabaraka. We don't say that the Quran is created. So the universe are ayat of Allah. And so it's here that for the last 100 years or so, 200 years, we maybe claim, but especially last 100 years, this is where kufr comes from. Because then the scientists build, so to speak, the scientist reaches a conclusion that God doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So it's in that type of knowledge where there's the Aqidah problems. More so than debating on how do we understand Allah istawala